Okay, so today it is time to start some wine. That's up next. Hello everyone, this is Dwayne.
And Lori.
And this is Healthy Farm Living. So we are here with wine again. We like our wine.
We do.
For sure. So one of the things that we've shown you, in fact, I'll link one of the videos here. We've talked about some of the wine that we finished here in the fall of 2020. Mm-hmm. However, we have more wines to go.
We do.
And we have more fruit that we need to get through.
Yes.
So one of the things that we like to do here is we like to show you guys, obviously, things that are healthy and maybe in different ways that you may not necessarily think about. When it comes to wine, one of those things would, in our opinion, really be that emotional and mental health. Sometimes you just need a small glass of wine at the end of a long day, or to enjoy in the afternoon on the weekends. Mm-hmm. That's nice as well. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to walk you through step by step. This will actually be the beginning of a series. Walk you through the making of our fig wine, one of our favorites. Yeah. However, before we start that, we have some wine that's been sitting in the bottle begging us to try it for the better part of the last 6 to 7 months. So before we get started, let's go ahead and try some of our wine that's slightly aged to give you an idea of what this fig wine is going to look like. Just a beautiful, beautiful golden color, golden brown.
It's really pretty.
Just a really, really pretty wine. It's actually, we were able to clear this up pretty well. Sometimes it doesn't clear up quite as well as others, but this cleared up really well. Smell it. Ooh, you can smell the figs a little bit, kind of that caramel smell from the figs. That smells good. Okay, so get an idea of the color. Let's go ahead and see what this is gonna taste like when we're done. Oh my. Oh, that is good. What do you think?
It's good. Yeah, it doesn't need to be sweeter, that's for sure.
No. Yeah, one of the things that we do, and we'll show you in this series, is back sweetening. I think we back sweeten this just about perfect.
Yeah, that's good.
We're gonna walk you through these steps so you get an idea of how you're gonna take fresh figs and turn them into this. Here is the things we're going to be starting with today. So obviously the first thing would be figs. You'll notice there's a white haze on these, and that's because these are not technically fresh. These are actually frozen. So what we've done is we've taken fresh figs, cut off the tops. You'll take these and flash freeze them so they stay separate like you see here, which basically means just make them cold enough so they don't clump together. Then you'll hard freeze them at least overnight so that they're solid. The reason why you want to do that is that freezing will break the cell molecules in the figs, which will release basically a fig nectar. Figs don't have a tremendous amount of water, so we'll be adding a lot of sugar water in order to make this wine. However, we want to get extract as much nectar out of these as we can, and freezing your fresh figs is the best way to do it. That's what you see here. So 25 pounds of figs is what we'll be starting with today for this recipe. A couple other things we're going to need as far as supplies. We are going to be using Camden tablets or potassium metabisulfite. We're going to be using these in order to kill off any natural yeast that would be occurring on the fruit itself. We're also going to need an acid blend. Figs themselves are not extremely acidic, so we are definitely going to need to add some acid. And I do have some testing strips here. I do have a recipe that we like to follow that we've come up with that works for us. However, I will test the acid level just to make sure we're in the right range. Pectic enzyme, but that won't be until we pitch the yeast tomorrow. We will have some yeast nutrient, and we're going to be using 2 different types of yeast. I like the Red Star yeast. It's what I'm familiar with. And the 2 different types of yeast that we're going to use is the Premier Cuvée and the Premier Blanc. I like the combination of those 2. They have a very high tolerance for alcohol, and we do like our wines a little bit on the strong side because we don't need to drink as much of the liquid. So you'll see us using those tomorrow. But the first thing we need to do is take a look at the figs that we have had sitting out overnight. We have 25 pounds of figs split up between our main primary fermenter, which is this bucket here, and a smaller bucket here, just to spread them out so that they thaw a little quicker. Again, these have been thawing overnight. They were frozen solid. Lori's gonna slide in and we'll take a look at what happens when you take those frozen figs and you let them sit. So you'll see we got kind of some mushy figs, which is pretty typical. We will break these down even further. But most importantly, what I want you to see is that nectar that we have right there. So you can see just having those frozen figs thaw back out, they're releasing just that wonderful, sweet, figgy nectar. We need to break these up a bit. Now, we've learned from experience, you don't want to blend these. We do want to chop them up. We'll use a couple different things to do that. One of them we're going to use is basically just a masher, something that we would use to model our ferments, or anything that you have that is something that can mash these figs up to get as much juice out of there as you can. So Lori and I are going to go ahead and get to work, use a little elbow strength, and show you what this looks like in our primary fermenter when we're done. You'll see what it looks like. Just basically, well, it's mush. And that's exactly what you want. You can see we're already up to about 3 gallons. I don't know if you can make that out on camera or not. However, as you can see, we don't have a lot of liquid in here. So what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna go ahead and put 5 gallons of water into here. Our goal is to finish with somewhere between 5 and 6 gallons of wine. So to 5 gallons of water, we're gonna be adding a very, very simple syrup. The water we're gonna be using is well water that is filtered. We have a whole home filtration system. If you don't have that, just some bottled water would be fine. You really don't wanna use tap water because tap water has chlorine and it can cause some issues with the flavor. So a distilled water or a drinking water of some sort, some type of bottled water would be fine as well. Now into that water, we're gonna be adding syrup. So you can see here, I'm not gonna tip it too much. This is a 2-to-1 ratio of sugar to water. So for this example, we had 24 cups, yes, cups, of sugar, and we added 12 cups of water to it, brought it up to a boil, and now we've brought it down to about room temperature. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna be mixing this in with the 5 gallons of water. Once we're done with that, we'll be testing it. So one of the pieces of equipment that you're gonna need in order to get that done is some type of holder or beaker or some other vessel to hold liquid and a hydrometer. First thing we need to do is mix the sugar and the water together and come up with our first reading on the liquid before we add it into our figs. Now I need to get this liquid, which is now pushing 6 gallons, into this larger fermenter. Now I think we wound up with right about 40 cups, yes, 40 cups of sugar added into that. Right now we have about 9 gallons of total material. So that's probably about 6 gallons of water and about 3 gallons of what will eventually be a cap of those crushed up figs. Now we do test the acidity beforehand. Now we know that we're nowhere near where we need to be for wine. Wine needs to be somewhere between 3.4 and 3.8 as far as pH. So we do have pH testing strips, and that's where the acid blend comes into play with this particular recipe. We already measured out 17 teaspoons, and I'm gonna mix that in and test it with our acid strips just to see how much we're gonna need for this 6 gallons of water and 9 gallons of total material in order to bring it up into the right pH range. We added 25 teaspoons of this acid blend into our wine. Now, I cannot stress enough, this is one thing that we used to overlook when it came to the pH or the acidity of our fruit wines. Grape wines you're usually pretty good there because grapes are very acidic, but different fruits have different acidity levels, and we found particularly with the fig wine, we had a fig wine fail. And we're pretty confident the reason why is because we didn't have enough acid. So these testing strips are great because it gives you a scale on the back, and essentially what we're looking for is we're looking for that middle color, if you can see it. We're pretty close to that one. Hopefully you can pick it up on camera. And that's what we're looking for, that 3.6 as far as pH. You want between 3.4 and 3.8 traditionally. Either way, we know we're somewhere in that range, so we should be fine as far as acid is concerned. So last but not least for today, we're gonna be talking about disinfecting. So we need to make sure that any wild yeasts or any bacteria that's in this particular blend or the must, we need to make sure that we're getting rid of those so that we have only the yeast that we want working on this wine. So now you have options. Potassium metabisulfite is actually what we're gonna be using today, because we can get enough of it based on the amount of liquid that we have. You can also use Camden tablets. That's these here. So these are essentially the same thing, but the Camden tablets are dosed out by gallon. So 1 tablet per gallon is what you would use for disinfecting. So we're just over 9 gallons of liquid here. So we have right at about 3/8 of a teaspoon of potassium metabisulfite, just a hair above that, just to make sure we can get this disinfected. So that is actually gonna wrap it up for today. Now this lid, you can see, is not on here very tight, and that's on purpose. You can do a couple different things. We'll probably leave it slightly cracked open like this with a towel over the top. We wanna make sure the potassium metabisulfite has a chance to off gas and come out of the material before we add the additional ingredients tomorrow. So this is gonna sit for at least 12 hours. We should be back here tomorrow in about 24 hours, which will give the Camden tablets or potassium metabisulfite plenty of time to off gas. So here we are, it's actually about 24 hours later, and we are ready to add the last ingredients into our fig wine to get this fermentation going. So what you see here is a container, and it is full of 2 things. It's full of pectic enzyme and yeast nutrient. So the pectic enzyme, we have 4.5 teaspoons, so it's about 1/2 teaspoon per gallon, and we're dealing with about 9 gallons of material. The next thing would be yeast nutrient. So we have 1 teaspoon per gallon. Again, we're at 9 gallons of material, so we have 9 teaspoons of yeast nutrient. You'll see these 2 in this container here. So what I'm gonna do is mix these in now before we get our yeast involved. We've been about an hour or so mixing in the pectic enzyme and the yeast nutrient. Now what we're gonna do is actually start our yeast. So I've got 1/2 cup of water here. If Lori slides in, we want it between 95 and 100 degrees. You'll see we're right at about 95. Both of these are Red Star yeasts. We are using the Premier Cuvée and the Premier Blanc. I like using a mix of these 2 yeasts. We just get a very, very good solid ferment. We do want this fully attenuated, meaning we want all of that sugar consumed and turned into alcohol. And generally these 2 yeasts give us that. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut these open. All we're gonna do is just pour them into the water. So we need to let this sit for about 20 minutes before we actually pitch it into the wine. So we'll come right back to you. We have about 20 minutes on this yeast, and I think it's actually cooking up pretty good. So we stirred that in real well. Now what we need to do is go ahead and pitch the yeast into the wine. At this point, that yeast is consuming sugar, and this is your must. In other words, it's wine. So this has a ways to go. Typically, we've got about 4 or 5 days that this is gonna be in the primary fermenter. Now, what you'll wanna do at this point is leave this alone. So we're not gonna touch it for probably a good 12 hours or so. At that point, we'll check to see how the yeast is doing. That's real early in the morning, but tomorrow morning we're up early. So we'll take a look at this in 12 hours, and then we'll come back to you in probably about 24 hours so we can see exactly what this looks like when it starts. It's a little over 24 hours later. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is the lid. So this lid is designed to be very loose, and with this primary fermentation, you wanna make sure that you're giving it plenty of opportunity for the carbon dioxide to come out of this. So fitting with an airlock and those types of things is really not necessary now. You wanna make sure that air can get out. So this loose fitting lid works great. If you're gonna use some type of bucket, maybe leave the lid propped and use a towel or something similar to that. You could do that as well, but this lid, because it's loose, works great. So now we did stir this once this morning. We saw activity, so we saw it creating those bubbles that we're looking for yesterday evening, so last night. And so I'm really excited to see this. Now, if you can tell from the front, it's fairly easy to see through this primary fermenter. You can see that division line right around here. This is all wine down here, and this is all basically just the excess. This is all the pulp from those figs. So I'm gonna go ahead and lift this up. Let's see how we're doing. Oh wow, look at that. So now this, you can see, is solid. This is all of the heavy parts of the fruit that are rising to the top, and that's because the carbon dioxide that's being created from the yeast and them consuming the sugar is causing all of the solids to rise to the top. So now we don't want to leave this because this can actually mold. And we also want to have these darker pieces of fruit down in the alcohol so it can pull some of that color, that beautiful brown golden color, out of the fruit. So I'm going to go ahead and punch this down because we need to, and Lori will come in closer. You can see just how thick that is. That is all just solid figs. So we want to get that down under, and then as we do, you'll see just how much fermentation's going on. That's what you see there, that bubbling. So that is the same stuff that you would see in beer, and that's actually traditionally how you would add carbonation. There's a good shot of that, just how thick all of that, the solid pieces of figs are. You want to get that down under into the alcohol, and then I'm going to go ahead and give this a nice stir. Really get this work down in. You can see the need for that head space. That's really pushing it, just about to bubble over. So what amounts to probably about 6 or so gallons of wine right now is completely filling this up, and this thing can go to about 11 to 12 gallons. This is bubbling and fermenting very, very hard, and part of the reason for that is because we're so warm this time of year. We really like to ferment our wines and start our wines this time of year or during the late spring through early fall months, because our warm weather inside the house really affords to a very strong and hard fermentation. We do want to make sure that these are fully attenuated. So in other words, the yeast is completely consuming all of the sugar, and it does it very rapidly. And you'll see as we move through this process why that's so important. We will check this at least a couple times a day. We'll push this cap down just to make sure we don't have any issues with these solids getting mold. As soon as we see the fermentation starting to decrease pretty heavily, which is usually in about 4 to 5 days in our experience, we'll go ahead and rack this into a secondary fermenting container. It is actually Thursday evening. We've had our primary fermentation going for about 4 days now, and we saw this morning when we turned it that it's definitely starting to slow down enough that we can get the large particles of figs out of the must or the wine. So what you see here are the materials that we're going to be working with today. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is basically strain out the large pieces of figs from the wine so that I can get them into their secondary fermenters. So what we use are these mesh socks, for a better term. So I've got a couple of those. I've got a 6.5 gallon bucket and a 5 gallon bucket. Give us plenty of space for what should be about 7 or so gallons of wine when we're done. We'll also be moving that wine into secondary fermenters. So we have our big mouth bubbler, that's this here, and this will hold just over 6 gallons. And we also have a 1 gallon container here. I can't stress enough the importance of having several of these 1 gallon containers, because you'll always, hopefully, have some excess wine left over, particularly at this first racking or re-racking. You're gonna wanna use this to top off, and you'll see that here in the next episode. So for today, we've got a couple of fermentation vessels, we have a couple of buckets, and then of course we need to start working with the material. This gets really messy. I've got some old clothes on. You're gonna probably wanna do the same, particularly if you're working with either a fig wine or something darker. So you don't want it on a white shirt or something fairly new, because this gets pretty messy and you don't wanna splash on it. One other thing before I forget, we are going to be using airlocks at this point. So you have a few different options when it comes to airlocks. We have most of what you see here on our Amazon shop, so you can try some of those out, or another one if you prefer that. but you are gonna need to fit these with airlocks because once we're done today, you're gonna be more concerned about air getting into the wine. Today, not quite as important. You'll see that we still have a pretty good cap that's formed here on this primary fermentation. Still pretty solid because we still have fermentation going on underneath. But one of the reasons we like pulling this off now is I'm able to scoop this out and get this heavy material out of the way. So I'm dealing mainly with wine and smaller particles. There's already some wine that's leaching out of this, which is exactly what we want. A lot of the big material is here. You can see I've gone from about 10 gallons, I think, down to, what is that, about just under 8 or so of wine and material. What we're gonna do next, because this is mainly wine, we're gonna be using a much larger bucket that I have lined with another one of these mesh socks, and we're gonna basically be pouring this into that bucket so that I can pull that thing out and drain the rest of this wine and strain it. Now you do have the option of using those socks inside your primary fermenters. Lori and I have tried that a few times making wines, and it really just gets in the way and we get frustrated with it. So at this point, it would be an advantage. It's just tougher as you're going through the initial process of making wine. We have about 7 gallons of wine, and it's still actually fermenting pretty strong. We do have our airlocks fixed. These have water in them now, so we are now controlling the amount of air that gets in here. Now, because these are still fermenting so heavily, they're gonna push carbon dioxide out through these airlocks, so there's not gonna be any air in here by the time we get to the next step. And we know there's a lot of sediment, particularly in this fig wine. You're gonna get a tremendous amount of sediment once you get them racked into these secondaries. So we know that this whole gallon here is gonna wind up topping this off probably in the next step. Now, where do we go from here? We'll actually have these in a closet so it's nice and dark. We'll check on them every few days just to make sure we don't have any issues with the airlocks or anything like that. We're gonna be watching for these to clear up. They'll clear up tremendously over the next week or two just because of how warm it is here in the house. They'll ferment very strongly and finish pretty quick. We'll see a nice sludge layer or lees at the bottom of each one of these vessels. At that point, we'll be ready to go ahead and rack these again and get a clearer liquid, because what we're headed for is this. And you can see it looks completely different from the finished product, at least the way it looks today. So when you see this, don't worry, it will definitely clear up to this. So the next step will be racking these and removing that sediment, but that won't be for today. That'll be the next time around. So just want to thank you for joining us today. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or comments, leave those in the comment section down below. Instagram and Facebook, we post content there that you won't see here on the YouTube channel. Our Amazon shop, I mentioned earlier, but a lot of what you see here is in our Amazon shop. I'll leave a link down below. If you click on that link, it doesn't matter what you end up buying through that link, you help to support the channel here. And if I haven't mentioned it already, our primary channel, that's where we do all the farming, and where these figs were grown is actually on the farm. That channel is Edge of Nowhere Farm. Again, it's our primary channel. Would love to see you there. So just want to thank you for joining us today and remind you to be farm healthy. All right, done. Oh, that's good.